Hello, and welcome to LeanReads, the channel that turns powerful books into simple lessons for growth and inspiration. What exactly was the Cold War? A clash of ideologies, a geopolitical chess game, or simply the inevitable struggle between two super? The term Cold War is no longer unfamiliar to most people. Simply put, it refers to a series of conflicts rooted in the struggle for power and ideological rivalry between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, which began right after the end of World War II. But if we were to define it more precisely, what exactly was the Cold War? How did it begin? How did it spread? And what eventually brought it to an end? Robert J. McMahon's The Cold War, 2003, answers these questions with remarkable clarity and depth. Robert J. McMahon is an American historian specializing in U.S. foreign relations and one of the world's foremost scholars on the Cold War. He currently serves as a professor at The Ohio State University. In addition to the Cold War, McMahon has written several other acclaimed works on the subject, including The Cold War in the Third World Colonialism and The Cold War on the Periphery, a panoramic view of the conflict that shaped the second half of the 20th century. There are countless books written about the Cold War, covering topics like the arms race, the space race, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Suez Crisis, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. All of these are key events closely tied to the Cold War. When World War II ended, Europe lay in ruins. Yet from this devastation emerged two global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, each wielding immense political and military influence. However, with two fundamentally opposing ideologies, capitalism and communism, the US Soviet alliance quickly dissolved, turning wartime allies into ideological enemies. Any hope for post-war cooperation faded rapidly, replaced by a tense geopolitical rivalry that came to define the latter half of the 20th century, a period known as the Cold War. The phrase Cold War was first used by Bernard Baruch, an American financier and presidential advisor. On April 16, 1947, during a speech before the South Carolina House of Representatives, he declared, "Let us not be deceived. We are today in the midst of a Cold War." Later that year, in September 1947, journalist Walter Lippmann popularized the term through a series of articles titled The Cold War, published in the New York Herald Tribune, making it a part of global political vocabulary. There is so much to say and analyze when discussing this global confrontation, from the ideological divide and the nuclear arms race to the shadow wars fought across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Robert J. McMahon's The Cold War offers a clear, concise, and balanced perspective on how this monumental struggle reshaped the world's political, military, and cultural landscape for decades to come. The Cold War emerged from the ashes of World War II. In 1945, much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins. 6 years after the flames of conflict first erupted in 1939, World War II finally came to an end. 60 million people were dead, another 60 million were left homeless, and entire cities were reduced to rubble. Among the hardest hit were Cologne, Dusseldorf, and Hamburg in Germany, which were up to 90% destroyed. During those devastating years, the global order was completely upended. The Western European nations that had dominated the world for nearly 5 centuries were crushed almost overnight. When the smoke cleared, two superpowers stood above all others: the United States and the Soviet Union. In truth, the seeds of tension and hostility between the US and the USSR had been sown long before and even during World War II. As the self-proclaimed champion of capitalism, the United States viewed the Soviet Union's communist ideology as a mortal enemy. From the moment the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, the US had sought to contain and isolate the Soviet regime through economic pressure and diplomatic exclusion for nearly 2 decades. World War II, however, forced the two rivals into an uneasy alliance against a common enemy, Nazi Germany. Yet everyone knew that the relationship between Washington and Moscow resembled a marriage of convenience, not a genuine partnership built on trust or shared values. Even on the battlefield, the Allies could not agree on strategy. The Soviet Union urged the US and Britain to open a second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front, where the Red Army was facing the full might of Hitler's war machine. But instead of responding to this desperate plea, the Americans and the British focused on campaigns in North Africa and Italy throughout 1942, 1943. By 1944, when the Western Allies finally landed at Normandy, the Soviet Union had already been fighting alone, holding off more than 80% of Nazi Germany's military divisions. Given such deep disagreements, even while confronting a shared enemy, it is hardly surprising that the US and the Soviet Union turned against each other as soon as the war ended. A power vacuum had to be filled, and a shattered world had to be rebuilt. Yet the two superpowers could agree on almost nothing about how to do it. As the last echoes of World War II faded, a new struggle was already beginning to rise. The Cold War was about to begin. The United States sought to maintain the balance of power in Eurasia while expanding its global military reach. What would the post-war world look like? That was the central question facing the leaders of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union as they met in a series of conferences during the closing years of World War II. Both the US and the USSR agreed on one thing: the urgent need to restore international stability. But how to achieve it? That was where the visions diverged. Each side imagined the post-war order through its own lens of history, ideology, values, interests, and ambition. Their overlapping visions inevitably led to confrontation. To truly understand the roots of this conflict, we must first ask, what did the United States and the Soviet Union each want to achieve as the world entered its new era? Let's begin with the United States. America's three lessons from World War II. American strategists drew three hard-learned lessons from the global conflict. First, the United States had to prevent any single power or coalition from dominating Europe or Asia, especially the vast and resource-rich Eurasian heartland stretching from Central Europe to East Asia. With its abundant natural resources, advanced industrial and military infrastructure, and skilled labor, this region represented an irresistible prize for any aspiring empire. During the early 1940s, the Axis powers had seized much of Eurasia. To ensure this never happened again, the United States and its allies resolved to maintain a lasting balance of power across the region. Second, Japan's shocking attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 proved that the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans could no longer protect America from foreign aggression. Advances in military technology meant that distance was no longer a safeguard. Hostile powers could now strike from across the globe. In response, U.S. strategists concluded that the best defense was a global network of American military bases, naval and air, allowing the U.S. to project power worldwide and strike enemies long before they could threaten American soil. Third, to achieve these goals, the United States had to maintain undisputed military superiority. This meant several things: preserving the world's most powerful navy and air force, strong enough to dominate the Pacific Ocean and ensure total security. The Soviet Union protected itself by dividing Germany and creating a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. By the end of 1944, the United States had already secured a series of major economic agreements with its allies at the Bretton Woods Conference, laying the foundation for the creation of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, WB. By 1946, the U.S. State Department had drafted an extensive list of strategic locations where America could establish military bases, stretching from Ecuador, Panama, Peru, Cuba, Canada, Greenland, Iceland, and Morocco, to Liberia, Senegal, Burma, Myanmar, New Zealand, and Fiji. Some countries willingly embraced America's vision, notably Britain and France. Others complied out of necessity, such as Germany and Japan, the defeated Axis powers that were in no position to resist. That left only one obstacle: the Soviet Union, which had its own vision for the post-war world. The Soviet perspective: security above. All the Soviet Union emerged from World War II devastated beyond measure. At least 25 million people were dead, many of them victims of the brutal German invasion on the Eastern Front. Hitler's forces had occupied 9 of the 15 Soviet republics, destroying 1,700 cities and towns, 70,000 villages, 31,000 factories, and millions of hectares of farmland. It was not the first time Russia had suffered such destruction. Just 25 years earlier, during World War I, the same territories had been invaded, again by Germany and again through Poland. From those harrowing lessons, Soviet strategists drew two clear objectives: to ensure Germany could never rise again, to cripple it militarily, politically, and economically, to create a buffer zone around Soviet territory, beginning with Poland and extending across Eastern Europe, to prevent any future invasions from the West. To achieve these goals, the Soviet Union sought to establish or support communist regimes in East Germany, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary, a network of loyal satellite states that would form a protective shield around the USSR. There was now no doubt the American and Soviet visions of the world were fundamentally opposed. The Cold War was on the horizon. The division of Germany, the spark that ignited the Cold War in Europe. What would post-war Germany look like? By the end of World War II, this was the most contentious question confronting both the US and the Soviet Union. The final answer was clear enough. The US would control the western half, West Germany, while the Soviets occupied the eastern half, East Germany. For American strategists, Germany was far too valuable a piece of the post-war puzzle to be left to Soviet influence. Why was a defeated nation so important? First, America's dominance over the capitalist world depended on the recovery of Western Europe's economies. Without them, the US would lack both military allies and key trading partners. Germany, with its industrial base, skilled labor force, and technological expertise, was the linchpin of European recovery, a vital engine for rebuilding the continent. Second, if Germany were left to fend for itself, it might someday align with the Soviet Union or declare neutrality, both scenarios that Washington viewed as disastrous. During negotiations, the US and the USSR debated whether Germany should be reunited. The answer was an emphatic no. The Soviets would never allow their historic enemy to recover strength, while the Americans saw little reason to compromise. The stage was set for confrontation. From Germany to Europe, the deepening divide. From 1946 to 1949, the rivalry between the two superpowers intensified, first over Germany, then across Europe as a whole. The United States strengthened its political and military ties with Western Europe through the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and launched the Marshall Plan, a $13 billion aid program to rebuild European economies. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, tightened its grip on Eastern Europe. Southeast Asia became a battleground of the Cold War. As tensions escalated in Europe, both the United States and the Soviet Union began to realize that some of their deepest fears were coming true. For the Soviets, the danger seemed to be rising from the ruins of West Germany, a region rapidly recovering under the enthusiastic support of the US and its Western allies. For the Americans, a new threat was emerging in the East, as the Soviet Union moved to re-establish dominance over the Eurasian heartland. In short, the post-war ambitions of both superpowers were under siege. By the end of 1949, the long civil war in China had finally ended, with victory going to the communist forces led by Mao Zedong. Later that same year, the Soviet Union officially declared itself an ally of the newly founded People's Republic of China. In the following year, North Korea, backed by the Soviets, invaded South Korea, which was supported by the United States and later by China. Around the same time, both the Soviet Union and China announced diplomatic recognition of North Vietnam, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Meanwhile, communist insurgencies began spreading throughout Southeast Asia, in regions long dominated by Western colonial powers such as Britain, France, and the United States, as well as Japan. Fearing that the region might fall under Soviet or Chinese influence, the United States responded by pouring military and economic aid into anti-communist governments across South Vietnam, Malaya, Burma, Myanmar, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia. By 1950, American troops were fully the Cold War and the Three Worlds. Though the terminology now feels outdated, Cold War geopolitics was often described in terms of three worlds. The first world, the capitalist West, led by the United States and its allies. The second world, the communist bloc, led by the Soviet Union and China. The third world, the rest of the globe, much of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Before World War II, most of the Third World had been under Western colonial rule. But in the post-war years, as old empires collapsed, dozens of new independent nations emerged, each facing a difficult question: should we align with the West or the East? Naturally, both superpowers raced to win their loyalty. Between the 1950s and 1980s, the US and the USSR deployed every tool imaginable: economic aid, political influence, and military assistance. They sent advisors, weapons, and funds to countries they sought to court. They engineered coups, orchestrated assassinations, and sometimes intervened directly in wars, as the US did in Vietnam and the Soviets did in Afghanistan. Indeed, nearly all the actual fighting of the Cold War occurred not in Europe or North America, but in the developing world, the so-called Third World. The human cost. For both superpowers, the prize was clear: economic resources, military bases, strategic allies, and global prestige. But for millions of ordinary people, the cost was catastrophic. An estimated 20 million people were killed in Cold War-related conflicts, and 19.8 million of them lived in the Third World. While the United States and the Soviet Union fought for influence, it was the innocent and the powerless who paid the ultimate price. The Cold War ended where it began, in Europe. To make a long story short, the latter half of the Cold War can be summarized as follows. In Southeast Asia and throughout much of the Third World, the United States and the Soviet Union continued their indirect struggle, backing rival regimes and movements aligned either with Washington or Moscow. From the 1950s through the 1980s, conflicts erupted across the globe. Tensions spiked to such extremes that many people feared the outbreak of World War III. Between 1950 and 1960, flashpoints appeared one after another in Iran, Guatemala, Indochina, the Taiwan Strait, the Suez Canal, Lebanon, Indonesia, Cuba, and the Congo. But did you notice something strange? Not a single European country appeared on that list of global crises. What had happened to Europe? The answer brings us to the final chapter of this story. From Flashpoint to Stability, Europe, especially Germany, had been the original epicenter of the Cold War. Yet by the 1950s, it had become the most stable theater of the entire conflict. Apart from a few tense moments in Berlin, the continent remained remarkably calm. In essence, both the United States and the Soviet Union seemed to have accepted, perhaps even resigned themselves to, the division of Europe. The two superpowers, armed to the teeth with devastating weapons, understood that any direct confrontation would bring not victory, but mutual annihilation. This grim reality became undeniable once the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons, triggering an arms race throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Beyond building massive, conventional forces, each side began producing thousands of nuclear missiles, determined to match or surpass the other. By the late 1960s, both superpowers possessed thousands of warheads. In the event of open war, they wouldn't have to need to march their armies into battle. They could simply press a button and reduce the planet to ashes in an instant. The beginning of the end. Of course, neither side wanted to destroy itself. A long, uneasy stalemate settled over Europe. By the 1980s, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev openly acknowledged the futility of pouring endless resources into defending against a Western invasion that was unlikely ever to come. In 1988, he began demobilizing Soviet forces, withdrawing troops from Eastern Europe and loosening Moscow's grip on its satellite states. Within a year, those nations began declaring independence one by one. By 1990, Germany was officially reunified as the Federal Republic of Germany, a powerful symbol of Europe's healing. And in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War was finally over. The Cold War began immediately after World War II, born from the clash of visions and ideologies between the United States and the Soviet Union. It started in Europe, spread across Southeast Asia and the Third World, and, after decades of tension, fear, and rivalry, ended exactly where it began. Reading The Cold War by Robert J. McMahon feels like watching the entire second half of the 20th century unfold before your eyes, a time when the world lived in the shadow of fear, yet also in the light of progress. What makes this book remarkable is not just its historical precision, but its ability to humanize the Cold War, to show that behind the policies, alliances, and nuclear arsenals were real people, nations in pain, and leaders caught between idealism and paranoia. McMahon does not romanticize either side. He exposes the ambitions, mistakes, and consequences that both superpowers shared. For me, the book is a sobering reminder that ideology can divide humanity as much as geography, and that peace often requires more courage than war. The Cold War wasn't just a geopolitical rivalry. It was a mirror reflecting human nature, our desire for power, our fear of vulnerability, and our struggle to coexist despite our differences. One of the most profound insights I took away is that the Cold War did indeed truly end, its legacy still shapes the world we live in today. The alliances, economic systems, and political suspicions born during that period continue to influence global relations. Reading this book made me realize that history is never just about the past. It was a map for the present and a warning for the future. The Cold War reminds us that the most dangerous wars are not always fought with weapons, but with ideas, pride, and misunderstanding.